Hi, everyone who's already online. Just waiting for people to join, so we'll just wait a couple more minutes before we get started. And happy Privacy Week, everyone. Hopefully it's going well for you so far. Okay, well, we'll make a start. So thank you everyone for coming along to this session today. My name's Paul Holmes. I'm the Managing Director of Info by Design. So we're privacy consultants based in Wellington who work with organisations across the country around helping them to get their privacy settings right and to put customers at the centre of how they manage their information. And the purpose of the session today, obviously it is Privacy Week, is to run through some things that I've learnt in the work that we do. Obviously, we work with a wide range of organisations around privacy. And one of the key intersections that we see the privacy team has is with the security team and vice versa. And I've seen organisations where that works really well and they work really tightly together. And I've also seen organisations where it is quite disjointed. And the purpose of today's discussion is to go through and talk about, I guess, how the two teams can work more effectively together, some key areas where there's real crossover or synergy, and some ideas around sort of some focus areas there. We do have time for questions at the end, so please do just put your questions in the Q&A function in the webinar and we'll get to them at the end. But I'll get into the presentation just to make sure that we do have enough time for questions. And so obviously it's Privacy Week, so we're here to talk about privacy. And I guess, what does privacy really mean these days? So we hear lots of comments in the media and other places around privacy being dead, but privacy isn't dead by any means. The thing about privacy is it's a social construct. It relates to human rights, and what privacy means evolves with technology. So if you think about privacy and where the origins of privacy came from, it came with the technology in terms of privacy legal protections. It came as the advent of a technological innovation. So with the invention of the Kodak portable camera in the 1880s, people started being able to take photos and quickly sort of publish them rather than having the old form of photos with the tripod and everything else. And that created the first iteration of the paparazzi, where people were taking photos and publishing them in the newspapers of things like society parties and other things. And a couple of Harvard law professors got quite upset about this and wrote an article in the Harvard Law Review called The Right to Privacy. And that was the start of the discourse and discussion around whether privacy should have some sort of legal protections or framework around it. And it's evolved over time. So as technology has changed, what we think about privacy and what we think about information has changed, and it will continue to do so. So if you think about New Zealand, we put our first privacy laws in place in 1993. And what personal information meant in 1993 and what personal information is considered to be now are quite different things. Back then it was largely documents in a filing cabinet or a Lundia somewhere or on some on-premise mainframe system. Now things are in the cloud, they cross jurisdictions, there's information being created about people all the time, everywhere. And so our framework around managing that is partly legal and partly around what's socially acceptable. And obviously with most of these things, the legislation does take a little while to catch up. But within New Zealand, our laws are a little bit different than a number of the other parts of the world, and they are principles-based. And that principles-based approach means that they're technology agnostic. They were intentionally written that way. And while they aren't perfect, and definitely, there's a case to be made for greater enforcement powers for the commissioner, for example, they have largely been able to keep up because they still do say the same things as they do. And data protection is a core principle of that. And if we're thinking about personal information and that comment about it, how it's changed over time, I guess the other key thing that I want to make sure that we're all thinking about is personal information doesn't have to have a name attached to it for it to be about an individual. So obviously things like name, surname, address, medical reports, etc., financial information, they're all clearly linked to an individual and quite close. But other things like IP address and cookies are an example of something that doesn't have a name attached to it. You can't, look at an IP address and say, I know that belongs to Paul Holmes. But you can combine that with other information or other activities online and then use it to create personal information. And it can be used to track an individual's device's behavior online over time. So it is still personal information. It is still protected by the Privacy Act in terms of the way that you manage and use and store that information. And just so that we're all on the same page in terms of, I guess, where we come from a privacy perspective, for those of you who are security professionals, really the way that we think about personal information is from a life cycle perspective. So everything starts with collection. What information are we collecting? Who are we collecting it from? How and for what purpose? Obviously, once we've got it inside our environments, we need to make sure that it's stored and secured appropriately to minimize the risk of loss, misuse, or disclosure. If we do hold it and people ask for copies of it, then we have to give them the ability to access and correct that information. And we also have an obligation to make sure that the information about individuals is accurate, up to date, and not misleading before we use or share it. And then if we're holding it, obviously we've collected it for a purpose. We should be ensuring that we're only keeping it for as long as we need to for that purpose or for any legal reasons, and then getting rid of it. And once we've kind of got all of those things squared away and correct, that's when we can start thinking about using and disclosing the information, which again should be done in a way consistent with the way or the purpose that the information was collected for. So when we're thinking about personal information, we need to be thinking about how it flows through our organization in that life cycle view to make sure that we do have the right protections around it in every sort of stage of that life cycle. And obviously privacy and security functions are both two key parts of an organization who are working towards a common set of interests to make sure that we are focused on protecting the organization and the data that it holds and manages. And both should be a really fundamental part of the organization because we are effectively risk-based processes who are looking to protect the organization and its customers and employees from anything going wrong. So often what I see is that the privacy team and security team will be looking at the same thing at the same time, whether that be a new system that's being put in place, whether that be a new data set, etc. And fundamentally, both are influencers rather than owners of the risk. So we are there to advise and support the business to make risk-based decisions around the technology and the information that they're handling and managing. And unfortunately, it's still the case that for the most part, senior leaders don't really understand the technical detail of security or privacy potentially. And still sometimes even struggle with the concept around that. So we as professionals are constantly within an organization fighting for budget and recognition and fighting for our voices to be heard. I would say that security is a little bit ahead of privacy, generally across most organizations now in terms of awareness and budget allocation. And if you are in a security function, then you can help the privacy team in terms of I guess helping to shed light on the fact that it's not just about security tools, it's also about the management of the information and making sure that we are compliant with the Privacy Act. So with this presentation, I'm going to cover, as I touched on before, some of the key areas where there's significant benefit for both privacy and security if we work together. And it's really important because at the end of the day, from a privacy professional's perspective, we can't do our job without the security function operating effectively. And from a security function perspective, your job is significantly harder if you don't have an effective privacy function operating to support you as well. And so one of the key areas that the challenge is really around sort of, I guess, speaking that same language when we engage with business stakeholders. The more that we can sort of have a plain common way of engaging and communicating with the business stakeholders who we deal with, the better that we can influence people's activities. So kind of almost acting as a translation service across the two functions. Because many privacy officers don't come from a technical background, they're often coming from a legal or operational background, and therefore, struggle to understand the complex terminology that's known in the security space and continues to evolve. And given the complexity of that technical environment, if you're not coming from a real sort of technology background, it can be hard to know where potential privacy risks are lurking. So helping the security team helping the privacy team to understand the technology and business implications of the technical risks that you identify can help us then understand, okay, well, how does that relate to the privacy risks associated with that system or that storage mechanism or transfer mechanism, and how can we articulate that from a business rationale perspective? And alongside that, from a privacy team, we can help you to understand where those potential privacy issues or areas created by frontline operational policies or processes that could lead to security risks downstream. particularly things that might not be picked up through a standard sort of certification and accreditation process, like around manual handling of information or extraction of information from a system and then emailing, etc. And that's really where it comes down to sort of working together to consider that whole control environment. So a system that has gone through a certification and accreditation process and has been deemed fit for purpose for a certain type of information can still generate privacy and security risks. So file sharing, is a great example. So if you've got a file sharing platform that you are using to transfer information into the organization, and you can certify it to say, okay, well, it's certified to handle information up to, say, confidential, and that's fine, it's certified for that. But if we're looking at from a business process perspective, when we're looking at it with a privacy lens, we may find that actually it's not only being used as a transfer mechanism, it's now starting to be used as a file repository. And therefore, you've actually got another type of risk because the type of information that's going to be staying in that system may be over and above what it's certified for or what it should be used for in terms of any potential breaches that could come. And yeah, particularly breaches or risks that involve data that's being extracted from core systems and then compromised through human error or business process design. We may see those from a privacy perspective, and being able to share those with the security team and both work through together to look at the root cause can help to identify where those potential problem areas are. So, for example, if there's a customer relationship management system operating within an organization, and one of the functions is you generate management reports, but those management reports are spreadsheets saved into a public directory and then emailed all around. You've got risk outside of that certified system. So making sure that the lines of communication are open between both the security function and the privacy team can help to identify those potential areas of risk that may not have been previously detected. And that system and process perspective can also help to ensure that you've got the right joined up risk reporting to governance forums to make sure that they understand the potential risks associated with these types of things. So again, if you're looking at how you report on security and how you report on privacy risk or privacy events and security events, the more aligned that those reports can be and the more joined up, the more effective it is to help governance, senior management understand where the risks are and what needs to be done about them. And that's particularly important, I guess, we see in terms of change-related risk. So privacy impact assessments. So change, new projects or new systems is a key intersection where we can work together to minimize the potential risk of new or changing systems or technology. Because obviously a change in the security posture or security risk profile of a data store or an asset can have an impact on privacy risk profile and vice versa. And so operating processes that embed privacy by design and security by design early in any change process is the best way to make sure that we are managing this risk and achieving it. So looking at, running a privacy impact assessment process and a certification accreditation process and making sure they're aligned, that the stage gates for those processes join up and inform each other at the right points in the process is the best way to do that. So if you are running in the security space, a certification and accreditation type process, make sure that a completed and approved PIA is a requirement for that certification and accreditation process to be completed if it's not. And also if you're doing recertification of systems every sort of period, whether that be 12 months, 2 years, again, the privacy impact assessment should be completed again at the same time to make sure that there's no new privacy risks that have been generated in the same period. So thinking about potentially having a shared register of assessments is a really good way of making sure that you're across things, or a register of data assets where you've got clarity around what assessments have been performed where and when are they due to be repeated is really important. Again, if you have those processes joined up, then it makes sure that specialist advice is engaged, ideally early and at the initiation or design phase of any change. And there's lots of benefits to that. So obviously timely input into requirements and early identification of potential risk areas. Far easier to cover that in design rather than just pointing out the flaws or the issues. And that can avoid downstream remedial activities that leads to budget overruns and delays. Also really helps with capacity planning, because obviously, I don't know about everyone on the call, but generally speaking, both privacy teams and security teams are under-resourced and overworked. So the more we can have visibility of what assessments are coming down the pipeline when, the better. And also by having the processes joined up and engaging early in any change project or initiative, it helps to build better relationships with the business stakeholders because you're helping them to get it right rather than pointing out the areas where they've got it wrong. And ideally, this will also flow through to better management of overall privacy risks, and particularly in the current environment, vendor-related risks, because they are one of the, I guess, key emerging areas that are coming through. Because vendor management is a challenge, there's no getting around that, and it's a significant risk from both a privacy and security perspective. What I find in terms of the organizations that we work with is that security teams are often contacted before privacy teams when the business wants to purchase a new system or technology. But on the flip side, privacy team may be contacted before the security team when the business wants to start using an existing technology or system for a different purpose or a different function. So again, making sure that we're both on the same page and communicating as effectively as possible is really important there. Also, if you are doing, from a security perspective, any endpoint monitoring or those sorts of things, and you're identifying, say, dark assets or other, potentially risky areas, making sure that you're flagging those with the privacy team as well, because while a dark asset obviously is not great from a security perspective because it's not necessarily controlled and governed, it might be an even bigger risk from a privacy perspective if you're storing customer data in a system that's potentially freeware or outside of the organization's network. So making sure that there is that effective flow of information when these things are identified is really important to help minimize that risk. And also doing that upfront assessment around new vendors from both a privacy and security perspective at the right time is really important, because it's far easier to get a vendor to agree to include or modify some data protection clauses or something associated with their terms when you're dealing with the sales reps from the vendor. Rather than once you've already made a procurement decision and you're dealing with the lawyers to get the final terms negotiated. So really important to get that done up front. Also, that vendor assessment and monitoring should be a dynamic process so that we're identifying changes in the risk profile. So that's an area where the certification, accreditation, and privacy impact assessment processes may differ. So a good example of that is something like Microsoft Azure Landing Zone. So you may certify Microsoft Azure Landing Zone from a security perspective to say it can handle data up to this level, and that's fine. Privacy will be looking at it at the same time and saying, okay, well, for the use cases that are currently within scope, we're assessing the privacy risk and it's deemed to be fit for purpose and implemented. However, 12 months down the track, while the security posture of Azure Landing Zone might still be pretty much the same, there may be 15 or 20 or 30 different other use cases or data stores that have been spun up within there for different applications. So making sure that the privacy team and security team both are across and aware of those changes. And as if you're doing your standard security monitoring, if you see any changes in vendor security posture, data risk profile of what's stored in assets, or new use cases or solutions, making sure that you do have that common sort of, I guess, way of sharing that information to make sure that you are across it is really important. And this is doubly important in relation to vendors who may be storing or processing sensitive categories of information. And we've seen lots of cases in the media recently around breaches associated with vendor systems being compromised. And obviously, the goal of both privacy and security team is to make sure that that doesn't happen to our organizations. Also, having a common shared definition of what is considered sensitive information is really important to be able to properly assess both risk posture and control adequacy. So sensitive information obviously will concern both or contain both personal and non-personal information, so corporate records, board reports, etc. But if the privacy and the security teams have differing views on what is sensitive, then it can make it really challenging for the business to understand what their obligations are and create confusion over risk profile. So we see that play out when you're talking about sort of PSR sensitivity categories versus people talking about personal information being sensitive because someone could be embarrassed about it. So making sure that you're using the same consistent terminology and definitions with the business across both functions is really important. And that is also because sensitive information is contextual depending on your industry and the type of information that you have. So generally, from a privacy perspective, the most sensitive categories of personal information are health and medical information, biometric and financial information. And we've definitely seen in the recent breaches that have played out in the media that those types of things, being the things that are compromised, are the ones that definitely do, make people the most concerned and hit the media in the biggest way. So if you don't have it working already, I guess the suggestion or my recommendation is really to look at how you can work with both your privacy and your information management teams, ideally, to develop that kind of taxonomy of information categories that you hold, and agree which ones are the ones that you deem as sensitive based on, both from privacy risk criteria, commercial sensitivity, and any other factors that are relevant. And then, wherever possible, make sure that that data is classified and tagged with the correct sensitivity labels, and that there's policies in place to govern and the use and disclosure of that information. So, looking at things like Microsoft Information Protection or some of the, I guess, the data intelligence and security tools that are out there at the moment to, I guess, apply that so that you do have the right protections and controls around it. And that can also lead to making sure that you can identify, okay, what types of data that we currently hold should we be disposing of so that we don't end up in the wrong situation. I just mentioned, just for those of you who may have joined after we'd already started, there are some time for questions at the end of the session, so feel free to drop them in the Q&A section and we'll get to them at the end. So one of the core tenets of privacy, when I talked about that information lifecycle view earlier, is around data minimization, effectively. So making sure that you only hold the data that you need for the purpose that you need it, and then you're getting rid of it when you no longer need it or no longer have a lawful purpose or lawful requirement to hold it. And disposing of it securely when you're done with it is really important. I mean, you only need to look at, say, the Latitude breach or the Optus breach that have been recently. And, one of the biggest issues with those is that there's massive over retention of information for, 10 plus years, which is affecting individuals who may not even be customers or engaged with that organization any longer and might not have for a number of years. And this is probably one of the areas where just about every organization we work with struggles to get it right. It's always in the too hard basket because the amount of resources that are required to go through and identify what types of data do we have, where do we store it, how long are we holding it for, and what needs to be done with it once it's gone. It takes a lot of resource and it's definitely in the too hard basket. But doing it right and having those effective data minimization processes in place have massive benefits from both a privacy compliance and a data security perspective, because again, at the end of the day, if you don't hold it, it can't be compromised. And also, while storage is obviously getting much more scalable and much cheaper, if you're holding stuff that you don't need, you're still paying for things that you don't need to be holding, which you could be diverting those resources to other areas. So one of the ways that I think that can be most effectively done is, again, joining up with your privacy and your information management teams to make sure that you understand those types of records that you have and what legislative or other obligations you have to hold them. But then also looking at, okay, well, what other things that you currently have access to could help you to identify where there is potential over collection or potential information holding risks. So from a security perspective, if you're aware of what are the key data collection or ingestion points where information is coming into the organization, then sharing those with the privacy officer or the privacy function so that they can look and say, okay, well, what types of information are coming in? Should we be storing that? Should we be holding it? So that you can then start having some of those discussions. Also collaborating to make sure that you kind of define what those clear retention policies should be, and that you have them implemented effectively across the organization, will continue to drive down that risk profile. And if you have shared that information, you're working together on it, then that can really help to push the information up to your governance committees around, hey, this is the risk exposure that we're currently sitting on. And this is why we need to make the case for change. And what I'll often see in organizations is the security team will be reporting a risk in a risk register somewhere. The privacy team may also be reporting a risk in a risk register. Information management may be reporting risk in a risk register, but they're not joined up, and therefore governance is getting 3 different views of the same risk rather than one presentation of, hey, this is the compelling organizational risk, and here's the supporting rationale for why it is something that needs to be managed or treated higher. around that. And yeah, again, I recognize this is one of the hardest things that we're going to be dealing with over the next couple of years, but it is very much on the radar of organizations, and particularly, where you have breaches or where you're dealing with Privacy Act requests and people are getting copies of the information you hold about them. This is the areas that tend to generate significant numbers of complaints or queries. Going through that work can also help to identify areas of the business that might need additional training or guidance to ensure they're not introducing unnecessary risks into the business. So, hey, looking at, okay, well, there's a whole heap of information sitting here that is very rarely accessed and potentially sensitive information. The privacy function can then go and sit down with the business and say, okay, well, why do we need this information? What's our lawful purpose? What are we doing about it? And start picking off some of those kind of higher risk information stores as well. Because training is, I guess, an ongoing need and an ongoing challenge, because fundamentally, at the end of the day, people are our biggest vulnerability in terms of both privacy and security risk, but they can be one of our best defenses if they are tasked and focused in the right way. So having good, robust training and communication around both privacy and security is really important, and ideally the two should be aligned to and reinforce each other rather than be developed in silos. Because again, ideally what we're trying to do is build a privacy and security aware culture where people are making informed decisions and thinking about the risks associated with what they're doing before they act. So obviously we have things like Privacy Week this week, Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and if you're not already, then I really encourage both the privacy and security teams to meet together to think about how can we collaborate on the communications around these particular weeks and use them as part of that kind of culture setting and scene setting activity. So looking at how can security messages be communicated during Privacy Week around particular areas, and vice versa during Cybersecurity Awareness Month, as well as just having a regular communication sort of focus or place where people can go for messaging and information throughout the year. One of the things that I think is worked really well for organizations that we've worked with, but is often not done, is sharing information about breaches and events and near misses that have happened to help people learn from it. So if you have a number of past privacy and security incidents, whether they be a near miss or a breach, anonymizing and distilling those down and using them as part of the communications that you send out to say these things have happened and here's what the potential risk was, or here's what the impact was, and here's what we need you to do to make sure that it doesn't happen again. It's really important messaging, and people actually engage with that really well, because it can be quite a good way to get some regular comms out and have people regularly actually reading it and engaging with it. Also looking at how do you deliver training. I know most organizations, particularly larger ones, have a kind of default of e-learning as their training platforms, and e-learning is great to help set some baseline messages. It's not the most effective communication channel, definitely, and there's a lot of people who do just, as we know, click through to the end as quickly as they can and not really absorb any of the information. So thinking about, what are other ways that we can tackle that? So a number of privacy functions run dedicated training workshops with frontline staff, whether that be through an induction or whether that be through a sort of a regular attendance at a team meeting, for example. So again, looking at how can that reinforce key IT security messages through those sessions as well. And likewise, if there's any sessions that you're running from a security perspective, how can you put the privacy lens into that to make sure that you are both working together and reinforcing each other's messages, because that's going to help you to navigate your way through together. And unfortunately, in that sense, there will still be breaches. I mean, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So making sure that you have your breach response processes joined up and aligned is really important to minimizing the harm to both the organization and the individuals. Because I see a number of organizations that we work with who will have a security incident response process, but also a privacy breach response process, and then a critical incident management process. And there's quite often, when a big event happens, quite a lot of confusion about which process should be running, how the processes should be working together, who's got roles and responsibilities around particular matters within that. So if you do have separate processes around privacy incident management, security incident management, critical incident management, getting together and working through and trying to understand, okay, well, what are the triggers for each of those processes? What are the off-ramps where, okay, well, this was a security incident, but actually, no, we need to treat it as a privacy incident, or vice versa. And making sure that there is really clear documented alignment is really important to having those processes work well. Because, we deal with a number of organizations, supporting them through managing a breach. And what we often find is that lack of clarity around roles and responsibilities and the disjoints mean that there may be a security incident and you're focusing on securing systems and containing the data that may have been compromised. But if that's the only focus and you're not thinking about, okay, well, who's been affected by it and what may it mean for them, then you potentially are not going out and notifying the individuals who are affected until many days after the fact, which then leads to greater levels of upset amongst the affected individuals in terms of, well, why haven't you told me earlier? Why am I only just finding out now? And likewise, if you're managing things just as a privacy process and focusing on that, then you can miss some of the things around, okay, well, have we got the right security around the information? Is there a wider vulnerability here that we need to manage? So I think, sitting down and reviewing those processes and making sure they do align is really important. Having a standard protocol where any breaches or near misses reported through to security should be shared with the privacy team and vice versa. Will help to ensure that as they are coming through, you've got the ability to identify the potential impacts and manage them in the right way. The other thing from a privacy perspective around why it's really important to make sure that this is sort of addressed early is the expectation from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner around breach notification happening ideally within 72 hours of a breach event. So the earlier that the privacy function is involved, the faster they can make that decision around, okay, well, does this breach potentially meet the reportability or notifiability threshold, and how do we need to go about doing that process? Obviously, if you have organizational incident response teams, particularly at the sort of critical incident response level, you should be jointly advocating to have both privacy and security represented on those response teams if they're not already, because they play a really important role in terms of making sure that the right decisions are made and that the focus around things like external notification and incident control, etc., are done in the right way, rather than just focusing on kind of brand management, which can often be where things go to first. The other thing that I think is really important or really advisable for organizations to do is look at testing your breach management processes. So collaborate on a breach simulation to test your response processes and step through and make sure that you do understand how that's working. And importantly, after you've done that, run a lessons learned exercise and talk about that presented up to the governance forums so that they can understand, this is what we've learned from it, this is what we need to focus on, and this is where we need to increase the strength or resilience of our processes. And the other area where I think there's a really big opportunity around breach and incident management is around the root cause analysis of all breaches and near misses that occur. So having those going through to a common register, whether they are just privacy, just security, or both, and that there is a regular process where you sit down and go through the breaches that have happened over the last period to look at, okay, well, what are the areas where there are potentially common root causes, common trends that are occurring that we can then start to proactively identify and work to remediate. Because again, that's going to really help to strengthen some of those processes and ideally, learn from the past mistakes to avoid them happening again in the future. So those are some of the areas that I think, are really important for privacy and security to be working effectively together based on the work that we do with organizations, and wanted to make sure that this session had plenty of time for questions and answers. So I see we've got some questions already in the Q&A, so I'll just jump into those, and please do continue to drop them in there and we'll work through them as we go through. So the first one, I'm a security manager and a risk-based inspector to the PA into a CNA process, which will include the business process, not just technology. Getting quite maligned. Apologies for that, didn't mean to make you feel maligned. I guess really just trying to focus on understanding how we can work more collaboratively together across both the functions, because it is a gap that we see across a number of organizations. So next question, what would you define as sensitive information from a privacy and security point of view? I guess, again, it really does depend on the context of your organization and what you do and what type of information you hold. As I said, from a privacy perspective, there are some categories that are clearly more sensitive. So medical, biometric, financial type information are ones that people tend to hold more sensitively and have more concerns about, or get more upset if things go wrong. From a security perspective, I guess it's really what are the things that could cause significant impact to our organization. So obviously things around internal workings of the organization, things that could expose the organization to risk of further compromise or espionage or any of those sort of things. And that's why it's really important to, I think, sit down in a structured way with representation from privacy, security, information management, and ideally some business representation as well, and start working through I guess what are those particular areas of sensitivity, what are the things that could cause harm to either our individual customers, our staff members and contractors, or our organization's brand, and then starting to prioritize them. So sorry, there's no clear answer that fits every organization in that one. Are there any tools or frameworks for keeping an audit of data that's collected by an organization? That's a great question. So there are increasingly tools out there in the sort of, the privacy automation space where you can start identifying or collecting endpoints and sort of, understanding what information is flowing through there. I guess really comes back to sort of, having an understanding of what data assets that you do have and where those key collection points are. So obviously, if you've got a website and there's forms on there, then that's one channel. If you've got paper-based forms that are uploaded and digitized, that's another. So there's no one tool that I would recommend, but just starting to actually working through understanding where those are. And if you are saying, okay, well, where would I start? So if you have a data asset register or a CMDB or something where you have your core systems recorded, then that's probably a good place to start, and then start saying, okay, well, what type of information is actually stored within there? And then where does that information come from? So starting to work back from there will help you to build out that register or view of it. Are there any PIA templates available from the Privacy Commissioner? Someone's already answered that, but yes, there are. So go onto the privacy website and just search privacy impact assessments, and they've got a toolkit there which you can access and use. Next question, do you advocate certifying on ISO 27701 at the same time as ISO 27001 to assure alignment? I think if you're going through the process already, then absolutely it's worthwhile doing both at the same time to look at that alignment and crossover. I wouldn't say to go and do those two assessments to start just to see if you're aligned, because they can be quite time consuming and intensive. So I think make sure that you as a business are ready to go through that process before you start down that path. But if you are doing one, then definitely covering both at the same time would be the right way to go. Next question, what are key areas that you think privacy officers should focus on other than working with the security team, or areas that you see them trip up on? I think one of the key ones is understanding where across the business is handling and bringing in information into the organization, and then working with them to help, I guess, identify how are you handling that? Are you doing it in the right way is key. I think, again, the other thing, if you are new to being a privacy officer, or if you're just starting to establish some of these processes, one of the key areas of focus would be on kind of understanding what are those breaches and near misses that are happening within the organization, so you can look at, what are the risks that you're potentially already running that you can start doing something about. The question about sharing slides. So I believe the session's being recorded, and I think it will be available on the Commissioner's YouTube channel, but I'm happy to share slides as well. I'll send them through to the Commissioner's office and they can circulate them or have them if that's going to be one of the ways that they're going to do it. How to protect corporate records that are stored on cloud. Now that's a challenging one, and again, I made the comment earlier around vendor risk being one of the more significant risks associated. So I think there's a few key pieces to that. One, obviously, before you're putting anything into cloud storage, going through and doing that due diligence process, so doing the privacy assessment to make sure that you're comfortable with the information being stored there, that the vendor's terms and conditions are acceptable in terms of what rights they have around the information or how they can manage it, making sure that their security protocols meet your requirements and that you do have enough visibility to make sure that you're comfortable putting it in there, and making sure that you are, I guess, keeping across the configuration to make sure that you're not misconfiguring anything that could lead to it being exposed. So there's quite a few processes around that, but looking at that privacy impact assessment and security risk assessment or certification and accreditation process is the right way to start there. So, and then one more question. Can you give some tips on how PA and security assessment review should work together? Which one should be done first? That's a great question. So if you're looking at the PA and security assessment process, what I would say is at the start of any initiative, and this is before a business case is made, before the teams have gone and tried to get funding or purchase something, there should be an initial risk assessment done, looking at both privacy and security to say, okay, well, what type of information is likely to be in here? Where are our potential risk areas associated with that? So that should be a minimum requirement pre-business case for any new technology or change project. And then ideally, what you should be doing is working through and looking at it from a design perspective. So privacy by design, looking early to say, what are the risks and how do we design them to minimize that risk? And then likewise, what are the minimum levels of security we need for this information based on the type of system or based on the type of project that we are implementing. So I would say the cleanest way that I've seen that done and work well in organizations is have that linked to the project management methodology and procurement process that you have. So engage with your PMO and your procurement teams to make it clear that someone can't procure a new system or a new asset without going through some level of engagement with privacy and security. And then I think as you're going through the assessment through the life of the project, having regular communication so that, I guess ideally you're engaging with the business consistently across both the privacy and security assessment is really good. So trying to both go along to the same meeting with the business stakeholder to ask the questions around what they're doing, or have both attend the vendor meeting to understand, minimizes the duplication and minimize the risk of sort of different perspectives on things. And then having a really clear process around, I guess, security risk assessment needs to inform privacy impact assessment, but also privacy impact assessment is required for security risk assessment. So having the sign-off processes aligned to make sure that they do join up is really key. Thoughts on ChatGPT? Don't ask it to write your privacy and security assessments for you, first of all. I mean, it is highly topical. It's actually, so there are some ways that it can be a little bit useful. So if you wanted to use it to say, can you tell me the risks associated with this privacy policy? If you're not, sort of, I guess, used to going through that type of thing, obviously it's not going to give you great legal advice, but it may point out some of the risks associated with it. If you're looking at from an organizational perspective in terms of implementing or using ChatGPT as a tool, I think do it with great caution and be really careful around what you're doing and how, particularly if it's associated with any personal information or being used in a way that could help to make decisions around individuals. Couple of things there. The Office of Privacy Commissioner has has guidance on their website, and there's StatsNZ's principles on algorithmic transparency as well that you need to consider around, are you making the right things? And again, Privacy Principle 8 says that you need to make sure information is accurate, up to date, and not misleading before using it. If you're using ChatGPT to make decisions that could impact on an individual, then you may be at risk of breaching Principle 8 if you're not doing it, things in the right way. How often would you advise training for staff on privacy and security? I think, really, really good question there. I think there's a couple of pieces to that. I think there should be at least an annual refresher of some mechanism, whether that be a webinar, whether that be face-to-face training, whether that be e-learning, whatever your organization typically uses. But I would say look at it as training and communication. So often the best value that you're going to get out of it is having a regular communication to staff around particular things of interest. So I used the example before of reporting on the breaches that have occurred in maybe the past month or the past quarter. So having that going out regularly keeps it top of mind for people alongside the, I guess, the technical training, the how to do your job piece. And I guess the other thing to consider there is if you are running a privacy impact assessment process, particularly with projects, then you can be looking at, okay, well, what privacy training should the project be delivering to staff around the use of this technology to help, again, reinforce it? Because obviously, if you're putting a new system in place, there'll be some sort of guidance or training for staff. So looking to piggyback off that and get better benefit out of it, particularly if you got project support resource around it. Any template for a cybersecurity plan? I think there's lots and lots and lots out there. I wouldn't want to point you to one template without knowing kind of the size and scale of your organization, because if you're a small organization, something like ISO would be a massive overkill. I think if you're not sure, then that's probably a place to reach out and look to see if there are any, I guess, organizations that can come in and give you some initial advice on that. And I guess looking at sort of websites or resources out there, so CertNZ has some good guidance and information that you could sort of use as a reference point. See there. And do I have any thoughts regarding Microsoft AI rollout within cloud systems? I mean, again, for any organization, anytime that you're going to be looking at using any sort of AI type system, I think, again, do it with caution and do it with governance. So just because it's available, don't turn it on without going through the process of saying, okay, well, are we comfortable that it's appropriate for us to use it for this particular use case and in this particular way? And ideally, if you're looking to implement it, then again, that should go through a privacy impact assessment and a security assessment to make sure that it is fit for purpose for you and does meet your organization's requirements in there. And that's whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Google, whether it's something else completely different, but just going through that structured risk-based decision-making process and ideally informing governance around what's happening before you do it is key to kind of making those decisions in the right way. And one more question. How do you talk about privacy breaches without it sounding like a blame game or embarrassing the person who caused the breach? I think that's really important. It's a really good question, so thank you for that. I think there's a couple of things there. One, obviously, you want to anonymize it. So you want to make it clear, put it at the level of an email with an attachment was sent to the wrong individual, leading to the disclosure of personal information, not this spreadsheet from this team, etc. So trying to anonymize it as much as you can. I think also having those conversations and having the maturity within the organization to have those conversations internally around, we're not doing this to blame you, we're doing it so the organization can learn from it. A number of years ago, I was in charge of the ACC breach response after the breach that they had in 2012, and it was one of the key things that we put in place that made a real difference around changing some of the conversation. Was we had weekly reporting of what privacy incidents or near misses had occurred through a reporting tool, which was then reviewed by the privacy team and circulated out. And that became a really powerful tool for people to be able to have conversations within their own teams to say, hang on a minute, okay, yeah, we've got this risk too. We need to be careful about it. We need to stop it. So I think, having the right approach to it, making sure that the person who has made the mistake knows that they're not being singled out or blamed, but that it's being used as a learning exercise for others, I think is really important to do that. And likewise with security incidents as well. Cool, we've got a couple of minutes left, so I'll just wait to see if there's any last questions coming through. What do you think about Web3 movement of allowing users to bring their own identity to businesses? Again, I think it's one of these things where, from a business perspective, you need to step back and look at, okay, well, what is acceptable from our purposes? What are we what are we going to be allowing them to use it for, and how. So I would say, do that with caution and go through a proper privacy and security assessment process rather than just saying, okay, well, that's the new trend, so let's adopt it. No, last one, join later. We're going to be sent a link for this webinar. I believe that the Privacy Commissioner's Office, you can find in the Privacy Week content on their website. I believe they have a link to their YouTube channel, and I think the recordings of sessions, including this one, will be published on the YouTube channel. And then one more question: how often should privacy policies be reviewed, both internally and externally? I'd say at least annually, and more often if things change. So if you're starting doing something different, or I guess operating a new product, implementing a new system, again, each time you're doing that, you should be reviewing your privacy policies and say, okay, well, we've got this new system in place. Should we be reflecting that in our privacy policy? Internally for staff, again, as you're changing operations, you may want to have more specific requirements around certain things. So I think, general rule of thumb, at least annually and at each time that you're doing any significant change or new initiative. Cool. All right. Well, looks like that's the end of the questions. So thank you very much for your time today. Hopefully that's been of use and given you some insights or some things that you can take away to your own business. If you do have any other questions or anything that come to mind after the fact, please get in touch. So at Info by Design, you can just search us online and you'll find our website and you can get in touch if you do have any other questions. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of your privacy week. Hope it goes well and keep safe. Thank you.